Throughout these videos, we've been discussing what it looks like to disagree like a Christian. Within the church, as we think about issues that are further down our categories of theological triage, things down in the decide and maybe the debate category, we realize that there will be a wide diversity of opinions within the church on these issues. Some of those will be right, some of those will be wrong. And what we've been discussing is how do we, when we have these different opinions and we think other people are wrong, how do we act in such a way that preserves the unity of the church, that helps preserve the consciences of our weaker brothers, and how do we act in such a way that still preserves opportunities with outsiders in regards to sharing the gospel with them. And so this has required a lot of thought, a lot of wisdom. But maybe what you've thought is that I have basically been advocating a view that says something like, you just shouldn't hold strong opinions on things. And you should just kind of look at what other people around you think and then curtail your own opinions based on that. Well, that is not what I've been advocating, and neither is that what I think Paul practiced. And actually, I think we're going to look at one more place in the book of 1 Corinthians to see how Paul is able to simultaneously hold very strong opinions of his own and be willing to set aside those opinions temporarily when he's around brothers and sisters or outsiders, where those opinions will either divide the church or lose opportunities to share the gospel. He's willing to temporarily set those aside for the sake of unity and evangelism. But that does not mean that he casts away his opinions. So I want to look at one more place in 1 Corinthians. But before I do, I want to set this scenario. So imagine that you have a brother or sister in the church who believes that listening to secular music is sinful and Christians shouldn't do it. Now, let's also say that you don't agree and you think that's wrong. But let's say you're in the car with this person and your radio comes on and you're listening to the top hits station, and your friend, a fellow church member tells you, hey, I don't think we shouldn't be listening to secular music. I don't think this is right to do. Well, I think as we think about everything we've been studying thus far, the right thing to do there would be to shut the radio station off. It would be arrogant and run completely contrary to what Paul has been saying to simply insist, my car, my rules, there's nothing wrong with this song, you just need to grow up. That would be using Christian liberty selfishly, not considering your brother. That would be very foolish. But let's say let's say you act wisely. You shut the radio off and you say, oh, I'm so sorry. Maybe you have a conversation about why they think that way. But let's say a week later, the person, this individual, hears through the grapevine that someone else was riding in your car and you were also listening to secular music. And let's say they come to you and said, hey, I thought we had a conversation about this. It's not right for Christians to listen to secular music. Why would you just do that? Why would you only shut the radio off when I'm around? If it's wrong to do, you should just not do it all the time. It's kind of hypocritical for you it almost feels like a politician-y thing to do, to only turn off the radio when I'm around, but when I'm not around, you keep listening to it. Isn't that slippery? How would you respond to that? Well, I think we're going to see in 1 Corinthians 10, I think Paul absolutely has a category for believing that a certain act or view or something is permissible to do, but sometimes in certain situations, depending on your company, needs to be set aside without believing that this act is necessarily wrong. So let's look at 1 Corinthians 10. In 1 Corinthians 10, we're going to get an incident where Paul is returning to the dilemma in the Corinthian church about whether or not it's permissible to eat meat that has been sacrificed to an idol. Now, Paul believes that this is fine to do. He's agreeing with those in the church who he calls the strong. Those who have a strong conscience believe it's fine. Paul thinks that's correct. But now he's going to give a concrete example, a specific scenario about what you should do in a situation. So look at verse 27 of chapter 10. Here's what Paul writes. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you're disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. So if you're going to an unbeliever's house, someone who's not a Christian, they're going to set food before you. You don't know where that food has come from. This could be meat that was offered to an idol. It could not be. But Paul says it doesn't matter. Your conscience should be free. So you see, Paul's trying to shape the conscience of the Corinthians. He's saying this is of no matter, because in the verse right before this, verse 26, he cites Psalm 24, verse 1, that tells us that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Therefore, there's nothing inherently evil about eating certain meats, even if it's been offered to a pagan god. So Paul thinks this is totally fine, but he imagines a hypothetical problem. Look at verse 28. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. Now, we're not sure who the someone is in verse 28. There's two possibilities. The someone could be the unbeliever who invited you over, and as they're serving the meal, if they realize that this meat that they're offering has been offered in a pagan sacrifice, maybe the unbeliever thinks, oh, you're a Christian. You don't worship, Zeus like we do. So maybe your religion doesn't permit you to eat this food. If that's the right interpretation, then Paul's wisdom here would seem to tell us that Christians shouldn't participate in acts that non-Christians would perceive to be immoral. So what we don't want non-Christians thinking that we are hypocritical, that we say that we stand up for our convictions, but when we're hanging out with non-Christians, we compromise. That would be a possible interpretation. Another interpretation is that the someone is another Christian who's come with you to the meal who has a weak conscience. I think it's probably that. Because we're told that you should not participate in this for the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. But then in verse 29, Paul tells us, I do not mean your conscience, but his. So Paul has been talking in 1 Corinthians 8 and 9 about this dilemma of a weak brother's conscience as it pertains to eating food offered to idols. So that's probably what he's talking about here. It also seems we're not really sure what it would mean to be acting in such a way that's considering a non-believer's conscience, why that would be a dilemma for Paul. So it's probably the situation of a weaker brother coming with you to the meal, and then he realizes that this food has been offered to an idol, and then he kind of elbows you at the dinner table and says, hey, we shouldn't eat this food. His conscience is alarm bells are going off everywhere. And so what Paul says, okay, well then don't eat the meat. But the reason that you don't eat the meat isn't because of your conscience, but rather the brothers. Now look at what Paul says. You can see the nuance of Paul's view of conscience here. Look back at verse 29. So I do not mean your conscience, but his. For why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? So, why should Paul's liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? So Paul is willing to allow his liberties to be curtailed. All of chapter 9 was all about how he's setting aside his liberties freely of his own volition, setting them aside for the sake of other people. But that does not mean that Paul is allowing his liberties to be determined by other people's consciences. So, were this weaker brother not there at the meal, Paul would then be free to eat without raising any question in regards of conscience. So in the same way, if your friend came to you and said, hey, I thought we talked about this idea. You're not supposed to listen to secular music. It's wrong. Why would you, only not listen to it when I'm around, but when I'm not around, you keep listening to it? That seems hypocritical. Well, I think you could go here to this verse and say, well, I see how that is binding your conscience, brother, and I want to respect you and help you listen to your conscience. But what is your personal conviction is not mine, and my conscience is not bound by your conscience. Maybe you could be humble enough to say, well, maybe you could show me in the Bible, maybe you could use the Bible to help shape my conscience, but as of now, the way I see it, my conscience isn't bound the ways yours are. So I'm free to partake as long as it's not leading the other people who are around me into sin. Now, what's tricky is that this obviously is complicated. And depending on the circumstances, each situation, the relationship to the person, this is going to be a very complicated thing to do. How do you preserve your own liberty and not allow yourself basically just to allow everyone around you to decide for you what you believe on things? How do you do that without encouraging weaker brothers to sin by violating their conscience? That's complicated, friends. And I think that's why Paul ends this whole discussion on conscience with these words. So let's read verses 31 all the way through the first verse of chapter 11. Here's how Paul concludes everything. So, whether you eat or drink, whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of the many, that they may be saved. Be imitators of me, as I am of Christ. Verses 31 through 33 provide a great banner over this whole discussion. What's Paul's aim in doing what he's doing? I think those verses help explain that really well. But again, what does it look like to do everything to the glory of God, including how you eat and you drink? How are you supposed to live in a way that you give no offense to anyone? You're not seeking your own advantage. You're trying to seek the advantage of many that they may be saved. How do you do that, but still preserve your own Christian liberty, and then also know where to draw the lines on doctrine that's more important that you cannot budge on? How do you know how to do all of that in this complicated world that we live in? Well, I think that's why he ends with chapter 11, verse 1. Be imitators of me, as I am of Christ. The best way to learn how to use your conscience well in these areas of disagreement is to have a real life example. This is why pastors and elders are so important in the church. Pastors and elders are to be a model of what this looks like, how to use Christian liberty and conscience well. That's why it's so important to have someone else that you can see how they handle situations. So if you're baffled about how do I respond to this particular situation in this really tricky way, well, it might be wise to find an older, godlier, more mature Christian and look at what they do. Ask what they're doing. We can imitate them as they imitate Christ.